And welcome back. The goal for any refugee is to one day not be a refugee anymore, to have a permanent home for yourself and your descendants as soon as you can. When it comes to helping refugee groups around the world, the UN seems to have the same view, except when it comes to the Palestinians. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, also known as UNRWA for short, has actually perpetuated the Palestinian refugee problem in a disastrous way. The Trump administration, to its credit, figured that out early on and recently cut all U.S. funding to UNRWA. We caught up with Middle East historian and Palestinian refugee expert Asaf Romarowski in Washington, D.C. to find out why this was so important. Take a look. We're talking about this organization, UNRWA, this alphabet soup, UNWRA. Tell us, first of all, what UNRWA is for our viewers who might not know. And secondly, why it's so vital that the Trump administration pulled funding from this organization.
Sure. UNRWA is uniquely defined a refugee like no other refugee population worldwide. And what is unique about UNRWA actually is the lineage aspect. The definition of an Arab-Palestinian refugee, according to UNRWA's accords, is anybody who was in mandatory Palestine between 1946 and 1948, and the kicker is, and their descendants. Nobody else has that lineage aspect. Wow. So when you talk about numbers today, how is UNRWA talking about we have millions of refugees, where they all come from? It stems from the actual aspect of the lineage. And only Palestinians have the element of inheriting refugee status.
Out of all the refugee groups in the world, and there are many, many refugees, just think of the Syrian refugees right now, a very hot issue. Out of all of those refugee groups around the world, only Palestinian refugees are in a situation where their descendants are also considered refugees.
Correct.
To the tune of 5 million now.
6 million in the most conservative accounts. So I've come across in my research between even to 8 to 10 million, depending on who you ask. And you're correct. I mean, since World War II, there have been millions of refugees who've all been resettled over the years. It's only the Arab Palestinians who continue to exist. And that has to do with the fact that, to my mind, and this is what my research has basically unearthed over the years, is that Palestinian identity is synonymous to Palestinian refuginess. So when you tell a Palestinian you're no longer a refugee, you say you're no longer a Palestinian. So it's much easier to maintain them in the stasis, which they've done, and you can find quotes all the way back from Nasser all the way to individuals like bin Laden and Saddam Hussein and others who've all said, we're never going to rest until we solve the Arab-Palestinian refugee problem. Right. It's a vehicle of economic warfare. It's become a vehicle of actual warfare, all against the state of Israel, holding Israel accountable for this reality.
The Palestinian refugee issue, if the UN had its way and UNRWA had its way, this UN arm,
right,
would never end. And those numbers of Palestinian refugees would just keep increasing and increasing. That's very important for many reasons, chief of which is they are demanding a right of return.
Right.
To Israel, Israel would cease to be a Jewish state.
Well, that's exactly the point. So the right of return and the entire demand for a right of return is actually the entire raison d'etre of UNRWA altogether. So long as there is an existence of a right of return, or a so-called right of return, and I highlight the word right because it is seen actually as a divine right, and arguably within Palestinian society, I would argue that no Palestinian leader feels that he has the mandate to give up this collective right. Yeah. So nobody dares to put it on the table. And so what you have is that UNRWA has become the gatekeeper of the right of return. So long as, again, the numbers continue to grow, UNRWA is in business. I mean, no bureaucracy has any desire to go out of business. And so it's the only population where Palestinians and their constituency continues to grow. I mean, actually, UNRWA today is the largest employer of Palestinians in the tone of 30,000 individuals, all working for the cause. And so they've basically taken over the agency and are basically running it. UNRWA does no vetting when it comes to terrorism. When you apply for an UNRWA job, you doesn't say, were you ever a member of a foreign terrorist organization? Actually, being a member of Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad is diversity. And so UNRWA...
The UN, ladies and gentlemen.
Exactly. Over the years, UNRWA have said they've done a better job on vetting, but when it comes to American foreign policy, and for that matter, Israeli foreign policy, UNRWA has refused to use our own watch lists because they say that our watch lists are tainted. So you could be a driver, ambulance driver, a teacher by day, and a member of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad or Hamas by night.
And Asaf, I think the key point here in all of this talking UNRWA is American taxpayer dollars.
Yes.
We're helping to fund this organization until recently.
Right.
This is a very timely story, obviously, because the Trump administration recently announced they're cutting funding to UNRWA. Why is that so important, and what comes next?
By tackling the right of return head on, and by extent UNRWA, because UNRWA is the gatekeeper of this right of return, or so-called right of return, I would argue, then this is actually taking this off the table, because no Israeli government, left, right, or center, will ever accept the full right of return. It would alter the demographic majority of the state of Israel.
It would cease to be a Jewish state.
Exactly. And interestingly enough, the sister organization of UNRWA is UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Their definition, which is actually more interesting and more to the point, is only one generation. If you took that one generation definition based on the birth rate of the descendants of 48, 49, you would come with no more than between 25 and 30,000 individuals. And you could call it a day, a right of return.
So that'd be 25 to 30,000 Palestinian refugees, Asaf, as opposed to 5 or 6 million,
Correct.
which the UN is recognizing now. It's a slight difference there.
Slight difference, exactly.
Folks, it's so refreshing to finally see a U.S. administration hold Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority accountable for their refusal to work towards peace and accept Israel's right to exist. Well, coming up after the break, Israel goes to the moon. See how the Israeli space program is breaking new ground and how the Star of David will soon be planted beyond the stars. It's The Watchman. It's Christians United for Israel, only right here on TBN. Don't move.